Welcome to Steve Nallon's Ghost Stories. This episode, for the hell of it, the troubling tale of 7 little sins.
I think the inspiration for this story was more of a challenge, really, because Gemma, is my story editor, said to me, well, what you haven't got in your collection yet is a sort of full-scale horror, supernatural horror, like the slasher movie. And I mean, there's always the argument about whether or not ghost stories are a sort of subgenre of horror, or whether horror is a subgenre of the ghost stories. Anyway, I'd watched a film called Cocaine Bear, which I loved. It's incredibly silly. And it occurred to me that there's a certain type of sort of slasher horror, which is basically 7 ways of killing people. You just invent sort of 7 ways. So anyway, she said, look, can you go away and come up with a slasher movie, really? So I slept on it, and I woke up in the morning with the image of a severed head being washed up on a beach, and a beach party, an overnight beach party of young people, find the head. And then you ask yourself, where did the head come from? Why are these people on the beach? What are they going to do with the head? And basically you create your story by answering those questions. And of course, it needed to have a supernatural element, and then I brought that in later into the script. And one of the story tropes that we've talked about, which I'm very fond of, is sort of repressed memory, recovered memory. So I put a dollop of recovered memory in the story. And then a friend of mine said, he said, well, why don't you do it like a sort of an amicus thing, where you have sort of 7 individual stories from this base? And I thought that's a good idea. And so it was that's sort of the process of how it came about. And we're going to talk about this later, but it's actually very similar to in structure to your film choice.
So, for the hell of it, what's the story behind the story?
Well, really, there's it's one of those sort of screenplays. I've written it as a screenplay, where there are sort of multi-stories behind each of the stories, and it's an interesting structure when you're dealing with sort of multi-stranded tales, because there's different ways of doing it. There is the sort of composite plotting, where the stories overlap or interact, and you sometimes have the linkage with one character, which is the way Pulp Fiction works. I think the character is Marcellus. Or you get those films like Grand Hotel or Night to Remember, which is where the Titanic sinks, where a load of different stories are told within the sort of the one setting. The other one is the sort of meander, where they tend to be sort of directionless stories. I mean, classic one being Alice in Wonderland, but also Gulliver's Travels, and Forrest Gump, I suppose, is an example of that. But the one I chose really was what the story guru John Truby calls branching. And basically, in a branch, you've got a sort of single trunk to your story. And then independent stories sort of branch off from that trunk. And the way Amicus used to do it was to sort of gather a load of people together and then have a narrator tell the independent stories of all the people that were there. You get that in Dr. Terry's House of Horrors and Tales of the Crypt, and also I think there's another one, The Torture Garden. And in Fabric, which we've talked about before, the one dress, the supernatural dress, goes from owner to owner to owner, not unlike Black Beauty. Now, where mine is different to those is that all the characters that we meet at the beginning of the story, they all know each other. and what they want to do with the head. You know, some people want to stay on the beat, some people want to take the head, some people don't want anything to do with the head. So, and then from that sort of central trunk of the story, each of the stories sort of branch off, and you get seven individual deaths. They all die in interesting ways. It's a slasher movie. And it's a difficult one, really, because I think it's an interesting structure. But I know that if it was shown to sort of screenwriting experts, they say, well, where's your central character? You know, and where's the antagonist? Because all these are individual stories. And there is an answer to that, because there is a central antagonist. And shall we say that the central antagonist is hiding in plain sight? But probably can't say any more than that, because, well, essentially it's the world that they are in. But yeah, so that's my thought on the sort of the structure of it. It sounds a bit convoluted, but actually it's as I say, it's a trunk, and you get 7 different branches coming off it.
Yeah, in fact, it probably is. It probably is one of those types of stories that I think is now very modern, because you've got 7 different stories that are shorter than one linear story with one person to follow. People's attention spans and scrolling culture and things like that, I actually feel this works really well, because you can kind of move from one to the next to the next to the next and feel like you're, you know, in a different person's shoes.
Yeah, and I think they're slightly stylistically different, all the stories, in a way that I, you know, always usually admired the sort of Amicus sort of anthology portmanteau stories. I mean, most of the stories, and we've talked about this before, there's the sort of several stories in the collection, there's a literary element. The M.R. James homage, and Who Fed the Cat, Raymond Chandler, and so on. But this one really is movie time, you know, and I really wanted to get the movies in it. And now the severed head is interesting, because I don't know where that came from. So I woke up and the severed head was there on the beach. So I have no idea where that came from. I mean, one theory I thought, well, was that as a kid at school, we had images of David and Goliath and John the Baptist, both Caravaggio paintings, and these were on the wall at my Jesuit school. So maybe, but there's that.
Maybe,
but I did make a list. I did make a list, actually, of all the severed heads that I could think of in supernatural horror. So we're going to start with The Omen, where David Warner gets his head chopped off, and they made a model for his head. And he was asked in an interview whatever happened to the model. He said, I lost it in a divorce, which is really I Don't Want to Be Born, which is also called The Devil Is Within Her. Donald Pleasance gets his head chopped off with a shovel. Hereditary, there's a car accident where the daughter gets her head chopped off, and in a wonderful moment, the mother at the end of the movie slices her own head off. That's an unusual one. The Frighteners, somebody gets their head blown off with a shotgun. Sinister, you don't see it in Sinister, but there's a strong implication that the family are chopped to bits and the heads fall off. And my favorite, actually, is House, or I think it's Hasu, the Japanese movie, where they find the severed head down the well in a very surreal moment. And the Canterville Ghost, oddly enough, that's a bit of a cheat, because the kids play a trick on the ghost. But severed heads in movies is, I mean, it would be fun to do. We could do a video podcast on the severed heads in movies.
Certainly heads acting you know, separately from their owner. I was trying to think, I guess this wouldn't count, but I was thinking of in the one of the Creep Show films where Ted Danson is on the beach, and you know, he's got his head covered by sand, and I remember I've seen the making of that, and that's fascinating as well. But I also think as well, to be a severed head in a film, you've got to have quite an interesting look or shape to your head. Then Donald Pleasance's is more round and his features are quite pronounced, and that works really. Whereas Ted Danson, much like myself, has a rather large head, a tall head, so his really stands out because it's just his head. He's the perfect person to have it to be buried under on the beach with just his head showing.
Well,
Like I
the
was thinking,
model I
it's like
have
a
in my
cereal
head.
box shape.
Oh, let's think about this. I think the model I had in my head for the head that's found on the beach is actually the Caravaggio painting of John the Baptist.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I get them mixed up. Anyway, it's one of them. Where, and I think it's David and Goliath, where the head is being presented, and that sort of would be
Yes.
my perfect thing. But as I said, the it's a sort of written as a screenplay, and there's lots of other tiny little tributes to other sort of horror movies. There's a maze. One of the stories involves a maze, so that's sort of referencing The Shining, and to, I suppose, to some degree, the Harry Potter movie set in the maze. All the way through the film, there's sort of cutaways to vicious birds and what the birds. I mean, birds to me are basically dinosaurs with feathers, and they to me they're birds. If you want to see true cruelty in the world, look at a bird's nest. It's horrible. They sort of try to eat each other and fight each other and knock each other out the nest. And there's a sort of Hitchcock sort of moment potentially as well. Yeah. And also, we'll probably talk about this later, but a couple of beach horror movies, the most famous being Jaws. Oh, and Death in a Church. I wanted a Death in a Church, so that's a little tribute to The Omen. So I shoved in, whether subconsciously or consciously, I don't know, I shoved in lots of sort of filmic references as opposed to literary references. One of the things I really like about horror movies is that they go back almost to the silent era, because they tell their stories primarily in images. And I wanted to write a sequence that had no dialogue whatsoever. And so in this particular story, it's about Graham, who's the misery of the group. And he finds himself in a Victorian arcade, and he comes across one of these, which is the sort of laughing policeman in the casement. He's not interested in that, but he takes his penny and he puts it in the haunted house Victorian automaton. And as he watches, weird things begin to happen.
Graham puts his penny in the slot. Yes, its movements may seem jerky, yet there's much to admire with this ingenious Victorian automaton and its ghostly effects. As his penny falls down into the machine, the attic bedroom of the haunted house lights up, and a gentleman is discovered standing in his nightshirt holding a candle. His bed sheets suddenly shake all by themselves, on strings, and the large chimney breast opens up, and through it comes the grim Reaper holding aloft his sigh. The cloaked figure moves across the room on a track, and when it reaches our Victorian gentleman, it strikes the sigh down into his chest. A small bulb underneath the nightshirt glows scarlet, and the gentleman floats up to the ceiling, and indeed into it, and, we must suppose, beyond that, into the next life. The grim Reaper turns to face Graham. The hood falls back, and underneath it is a skeleton with a large grin on its face. Graham then does something he hasn't done for years. He laughs, and laughs again, and laughs some more. Oh, but Graham is not used to such a curious noise coming from his throat, and suddenly the laughter becomes strained, worse. It turns into a gasping choke. Graham puts his hands to his neck in desperation, unable to control his panting hysteria. More breath is going out than is coming in, and soon Graham seizes up completely and falls to the floor. As Graham collapses, the automaton dummy of the policeman comes to life with a full frenzy of chittering, maniacal laughter.
For this episode, we're diving into two strange stories, structurally and thematically. We're diving into Theatre of Blood, one of my favourite Vincent Price films, and possibly my favourite Vincent Price film, and Umberto Lenzi's Nightmare Beach. So I'll start by talking a little bit about Umberto Lenzi. We'll jump between the two. The first one, talking about Nightmare Beach, it is a sun-soaked slasher. It's spring break. There's a biker gang. John Saxon's in it. It's just incredible. There's menacing behavior from this gang and a killer with a leather helmet electrocuting teens on the sand. And if that isn't enough, to pique people's interest, then maybe don't watch it, because what drew me into this film is, well, not just it's neon and bright and sleazy and bizarre, and it's a murder mystery, but it's the underlying sense of consequence as well. Behind those, and I wrote this down earlier on. This is my behind tan lines and bad decisions. But there's a strange morality tale there, and I think that's what made me think about how we take pulpy, sometimes people might say pulpy, trashy films, but what makes, for the hell of it, linked to this, I think, is that morality tale, the morality side of things, certainly with the religious element that you mentioned earlier on, that I think makes it a really good companion. Now, it's darkly written, and there are lots of little sins in there, in terms of who gets punished and why. But there's a real grin, is a silliness there. Both your world and their world reflect where indulgence is met with retribution. One's very, very campy and violent. The other one, I think, is more psychological, but still equally as violent. And when we're talking about repercussions of behavior, well, then, of course, we have to go to Mr. Lionheart from Theatre of Blood, because it's all about punishing, and it's all about making sure that the people who have wronged him meet strange and unusual punishments. This is the one film, Theatre of Blood, as well, that I will say where horrible things happen to an animal and I still love the film, which is very unusual for me. What usually, once that happens, I switch off, but because it's so campy and silly, I just accept it. So yeah, those are my two choices, Steve. I hope you can see why I've chose them.
Really, really interesting, and and of course the punishments really exceed the little sins. You know what I mean? It's the imbalance of it, and it's the sort of the unfairness of life, and there's a sense that there's an unjustness, but in a way that's sort of what horror slasher movies are all about. It's not, life ain't fair, the punishment doesn't always fit the crime, and it exceeds it. And yes, it's a fascinating sort of area, is that, because there's no balance in life in that sense. Well, there is in sense of, you know, you do something wrong and you get punished, but sometimes the scales seem to be terribly on the punishing side, you know, as opposed to the
we love to see that though,
sin.
don't we? We love to see that outweigh that imbalance. I think because in life, when we see injustice, we sometimes react emotionally to it. Therefore, we want swift and awful punishment to that person straight away in the moment. And that's what movies do, don't they? They give us that in the moment. So, for example, like you just said, you know, there may be a character where they've done something and it is wrong, but in terms of the punishment they get, it's wild and wonderful. The dog ends up in a cake, or they get electrocuted, or whatever it is, and we laugh and we get, because our naughty sides, we kind of quite like the idea of somebody who cuts you up in traffic, something terrible happening to them.
I think that's true. And I originally called my story a black comedy, because I was, you know, trying to think of sort of funny ways for people to die. And then, oddly enough, and this gets rather personal, it slightly changed direction. It changed direction a lot. To cut a very long story short, I discovered that a friend of mine, I had a very close relationship with at one stage, had taken his own life, but I didn't know how he had done it. And then a friend of mine said, who knew him, he said, he slit his own throat. And I was just gobsmacked by this and really taken aback, and it upset me for several days. But here's the thing about being a writer. It was the perfect way for one of the people to die in the story. And because of that personal thing, I mean, originally the screenplay was basically 7 ways of killing people in funny ways, like Cocaine Bear. But when I put somebody slashing his own throat in it, I really changed the tone of it. So it's the black comedy elements to it, but then it turns almost to a sort of a tragedy. And that was, you know, that's simply when sort of real things come into your story as you're writing it and change the nature of the story. What was meant to be a sort of technical exercise in writing a sort of supernatural version of Cocaine Bear actually became a very sort of personal story for me.
So the artwork for this screenplay, Steve?
Well, Scott read, you know, the screenplay and the 7 stories, and then he rang me up and he said, I want to do the laughing policeman in the arcade. And I said, that is exactly the image that I wanted. One of those things where there were so many images in the screenplay, but that he said, I want to do that one. And here we are. You know, this is the classic one. And what a wonderful sort of big grin he's put on it. Yeah. And the arcade and the fun fair, these are, for me, they're often dark places. They're fun, but there's a dark element to the fun fair. You know, there's the ghost ride for a start, the House of Mirrors, where we're all sort of changed. They're strange places, and I suppose the most famous film is Carnival of Souls, that, you know, set in a sort of weirdo fun fair. But there's also the end of Hitchcock's, I think, Strangers on a Train. That is, I remember, you know, the weird horses and on the merry-go-round, and, you know, coming at you and stuff. So I think it's part of that sort of, not exactly horror tradition, but the way in which horror sometimes uses the art, you know, uses those images.
I find it really, certain elements of it it reminds me a bit of out of season Piers, where they have the arcades and the machines and all the noises. So I live near the sea, but I've often, because we didn't travel by plane when I was a kid, we go to all the seaside places, and sometimes out of season. And I always found that when there's no one in these places, the noises and the sounds of them overlapping was often really creepy when you're just wandering around on your own.
Absolutely.
Add that to the weather, if it's darker and out of season. I can think of a lot of things like that, and there's a certain element there of just oddness because it's out of place and echoey. So when I saw that picture, I was like, yeah, this takes me there.
Well, you're almost a ghost in that city. If you wander around a fun fair when there's nobody there, it's almost as if you are a ghost, and where are all the living people? And I mean, they are really creepy places.
So this episode's book pairing, what have you gone for, Steve?
Well, it's a beach and it's horror, so it really had to be Lord of the Flies by William Golding, which was I did at school when I was about 15, 16. And interestingly, he wrote it in the reaction to Coral Island by R.M. Ballantyne. And that was a Victorian story, which is really quite colonialist in a way, where that basically the British colonials go and sort of put right the savages. It's a pretty sort of racist text now, but anyway, we did Lord of the Flies. I mean, it's in some ways it's a theological parable, because it's flawed humanity returning to potential paradise. But what I liked about Lord of the Flies was that it's also sort of an allegory of social structures, where Piggy represents the intellectual, but because of his looks, he's not ever going to be in charge of anything. And then you get Simon, who's a sort of shaman religious character. And then you have Jack, which happens to be the name of the devil as well, who's the sort of fascist fighter leader. And then Ralph, who is the Democrat with the conch. And it's one of those stories where literary critics talk about the Apollonian order in conflict with Dionysian chaos, and it's one of those stories where there is absolute chaos, and it begins with order but descends into chaos. And again, this I think always connects with the horror movie and the horror genre, because we're only ever one step away from Dionysian chaos. Where things can go wrong so quickly, and I sort of think, if you want to be a bit clever about it, pretty much all horror movies are a conflict between Apollonian order and Dionysian chaos. Anyway, that's my thought on.
Yeah, I was thinking the world is on the cusp of that, seemingly on a daily basis.
Well, it is absolutely, and that's sort of the point. We're never far from that sort of chaos. It's personal chaos in For the Hell of It, but we see it in societies and the disintegration of social structures and all that sort of stuff.
It never ages, does it?
It never ages. No, it never ages. Lord of the Flies is it's a wonderful piece of writing as well, and it stayed with me. I think it's one. I read books as a kid that never stayed with me, but certainly Lord of the Flies was one that stayed with me. And my story has got a theological element to it, very strong theological element to it, that's revealed to some degree revealed at the end. So it sort of felt a good pairing.
Yeah, it shapes your kind of understanding of the world when you learn these themes through a story rather than being explicitly told certain things, because you're working it out as the characters are. It's a bit like Animal Farm in a lot of ways, where you would look at Animal Farm and if it was just the political ideologies and it wouldn't be that interesting. But when you transpose it onto animals and humans, and it becomes, you can kind of learn these things in a slightly different way. And certainly I think that that's quite important, because we do revisit themes and we do revisit these things so many times that you can kind of learn in a more fun, accessible way, rather than and also work out things for yourself. And I think that even if we watch, I don't know, let's say reality TV, those characters are picked based very much like the characters are picked in Lord of the Flies. We want to see those things up against each other, but we're also making judgments on them and looking at our own moral compass and questioning things. To go back to Lord of the Flies, or even to go back to Animal Farm, I think that one of the things about that was that it shows both ideologies and why they both don't work. Whereas a lot of people are not very keen to do that. You have to pick a side. Whereas I think when you look at something like Lord of the Flies, of course, there are more characters who are, you identify with or you root for, but equally there are flaws to all of their approaches. So in terms of your story, I find it interesting because, again, there's 7 different people and 7 different things for us to learn about those people.
Well, my obscure, but I hope fascinating fact is that in the actual book itself, when we come to the screenplay, right at the top left-hand side is the letters AMDG. And when I was at school, a Jesuit school, we had to put those letters, whether it was mathematics or geography or history or whatever, we had to put those letters in our exercise books on pretty much every beginning, every topic. And it's Latin for ad maiorem Dei gloriam. And it basically means for the greater glory of God. And it's for those who know it, it sort of sets the tone that this is going to be a theological story as well as a slasher movie. So anyway, AMDG ad maiorem Dei gloriam.
Well, from the very I feel very highfalutin Latin based. Mine is the exact opposite. It's very trashy.
Dionysian. It's Dionysian as opposed to Apollonian.
There you go. Exactly. This is a strange one, really, because obviously everybody knows that Umberto Lenzi made Nightmare Beach, and we talked about it earlier on, but he completely disowned this film that I love, claiming it was mostly directed by screenwriter Harry Kirkpatrick, which was a pseudonym. However, there are so many clues, obviously, not that we have to prove it because we know it is him. It's a genre mishmash, but there's lots of sly social commentary, as we've discussed earlier on, but also as that kind of ties it with your story. But I just thought it was really funny that he was, he wasn't making it an Alan Smithy film. He was creating a character to connect to this film so that he had nothing to do with it. I just think that's hilarious. I still love it. I still love him. And in fact, that kind of idiosyncratic behavior is probably what makes it such a wild ride. So what's your final take on For the Hell of It, Steve?
Well, I think when we were talking about Tenebrae, I said that Tenebrae was a slasher movie for people who read The Guardian. And I would say that For the Hell of It is a slasher movie for Catholics. And I'm going to get a bit highfalutin because this is my copy from university days of the poems of Tennyson. I'm just going to read you a bit of In Memoriam. Who trusted God was love indeed, and love, creation's final law, though nature, red in tooth and claw with ravine, wreaked against this creed. And what we've been talking about is that theme of sort of order and goodness, and actually nature really comes in, you know, shrieking against this creed. And that concept of red in tooth and claw, which I read a lot in sort of books about horror, and they've taken it from Tennyson, that what horror movies do, particularly the slasher horror, is really just concentrate how nature is red in tooth and claw. And that is, you know, pretty harsh, but life is harsh and nature is harsh, and the birds that eat each other at my story and so on, we're never far from red in tooth and claw.
Yeah, Tennyson's so you know, ingrained in imagery, and that fits so well to the images of what we, you know, what we've been discussing, whether it's all the films that have kind of, you know, solidified and crystallized in your mind to create your screenplay, or the sort of big bright colors. And I find it really interesting that that you invoke him, mainly because when I teach about Tennyson, often I get a bit frustrated because of that kind of the way things are presented, what romanticism is, and what, you know, that kind of thing. And when I'm looking at how poets at the time behaved, and they had a little group of poets that they all approved of and pushed to the top, and ones who were a little bit grubby, they were trying to get into that group but they weren't really invited into the inner circle. I think that what we're doing, I think, with discussing all of these things together, is kind of saying, you know, how much fun you can have with the visual, and there is a real substance to it, as well as you know, substance and silliness, and bringing those two things together. My final takeaway kind of brings together substance and silliness, hopefully, which is Nightmare Beach and For the Hell of It. They might seem wildly different on the surface. You know, we think of Nightmare Beach, that VHS era slasher. And I remember when you were writing this, we talked about the setting of time and when this might be, and that was a really interesting conversation I remember us having. But both of these stories essentially ask us to think about choices, the masks we wear, and the price of getting away with things for too long, and conscience. And sometimes conscience can wear different outfits. And this story, I think, kind of cemented our friendship in a lot of ways, because all of those influences, we were talking about Amicus, Theatre of Blood, modern horror, and that religious, you know, I find I've got family who are Catholic and family who are Protestant, and I've had experiences of both sides of the those elements of Christianity. I found that all the conversations we had at the time and it today really interesting. It also made me think, oh, I would love to see For the Hell of It on the screen. You know, this is something I want to see on the screen. So my final takeaway really is just how this is a really great representation of all of those influences crystallized, and just how much fun it is, but also that there is some substance for people to look into as well if they want to dig a little deeper.
Well, I want to thank you, actually, because, you know, we chatted and I sent you the screenplay and you sent me lots of notes, and I love getting, you know, feedback. And eventually, yes, No. I really useful, and I wanted to set it in a slightly timeless world, but I think because of the conversations that we'd had, it eventually got set in the 1970s, and that gives it such a specific look. And I think, and there were other notes you sent me as well, and I incorporated those. So, yeah, and the fact that you said, look, this is a really interesting theological story, and why don't you submit it for Screenplay awards, which had never occurred to me, to be honest. And then I submitted it to various festivals, and it won a few awards. So
it won a lot.
I'm very thankful for that.
No, it's incredible to see them, and as all the awards, obviously, I don't want you to hide your light behind a bushel. There were so many great awards for it, and all, but one of the things that really stood out for me was the, obviously from all those awards you get feedback, and you get, you're looking at those, and sometimes you can get, not you personally, but anyone I think can get trapped in a loop of feedback and never be happy. But I think what you were able to do with this was kind of be very clear about, oh, that's an excellent point, I'll act on that one, I don't think and kind of bringing that judgment into it, and it's just been a wonderful ride, hasn't it? It really has.
One of the things that my ghost story collection didn't have, and I thought it should have, was a Marie Antoinette Toby jug, which you can see there. And that's in a story called It's What She Would Have Wanted.